Before coming to the unforgettable cases on the night of the snowstorm, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next videos of the channel. And comment to let us know where you are and what time you are so that God can send good wishes to you and your family members. And if we need to change anything, comment below. Thank you everyone very much. Story 1. The wind howled through the icy streets, snow whipping like sharp blades against Nathan's windshield. Thick layers of snow obscured his view, making everything seem like a blank, white curtain. It was nearing midnight, and Nathan, trying to wrap up his shift, accepted one last delivery to a house on the edge of town. The tip was generous, but the location of the house filled him with unease, though he couldn't quite explain why. When the GPS announced he had arrived, he sat in his car for a few seconds. The house stood isolated at the end of the road, with a dim light flickering weakly on the porch, adding to the eerie scene. Nathan grabbed the delivery bag, stepped out of his car, and his boots immediately sank into the thick snow. As he approached the porch, he noticed a note taped firmly to the door. The scrawled red letters looked as if they had been written in haste. "Do not open the door for anyone but me. I will be back." Nathan frowned, taking the note and looking around. Seeing no one, he decided to knock. The door creaked open almost instantly, startling him. A pale-faced woman with sunken, reddened eyes appeared before him. Her messy hair partially obscured her face, and her breath came in frosty puffs in the freezing air. "Did you see him?" she whispered, her voice so faint that Nathan had to strain to hear. "See, who?" Nathan replied, confused. "Your order is here." "Be quiet," she snapped, her panicked eyes darting past Nathan's shoulder. "He's watching us." Nathan instinctively turned to look behind him, but all he saw was white snow and darkness. He began to feel a creeping sense of unease. "Are you okay? Can you tell me what's going on? Who's out there?" Nathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman retreated slightly, her gaze locked on the void behind Nathan. "Come inside," she said, almost pleading. "Quickly, before he gets closer." Nathan hesitated. "I can't." "Get in," she screamed, her voice breaking, grabbing his arm and pulling him inside before slamming the door shut. Inside, the house was dark, with only a faint glow from an oil lamp. The small room was cluttered, with belongings scattered everywhere. A damp, musty smell mixed with the coldness of the snow-filled air hit Nathan's nose. "Can you explain what's happening?" Nathan asked, trying to maintain composure. "Who are you talking about? Is there someone out there?" The woman trembled. "He's not human," she said, her voice cracking. "I've locked every door, but he keeps finding ways to get in. He always finds a way in." A shiver ran down Nathan's spine. "Who is he? Have you called the police?" "The police?" She laughed dryly, her eyes hollow. "Do you think the police can do anything about this? He doesn't belong to this world. He's out there, waiting for you." Nathan shook his head, fighting the rising panic. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I need to leave. I can't stay here." "No," she grabbed his arm again, her voice choking with desperation. "If you leave, he won't let you survive." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The window pane rattled as if it might shatter at any moment. Nathan couldn't wait any longer. He yanked his arm free and bolted for the door. But the moment he opened it, he found himself face to face with him. He stood there, his eyes black as a void, as if they could consume everything. A whisper, faint as the wind but sharp as a blade, slipped into Nathan's ears. "You are mine." Nathan screamed and bolted for his car. The snow seemed to clutch at his feet as the sound of footsteps grew louder behind him. When he finally threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, the figure had vanished. But the feeling that he was still being watched did not. Nathan started the car and sped off into the snowy night. His phone buzzed. A notification from the delivery app appeared on the screen. Order canceled by the customer. Please return the food to the restaurant. Cold sweat drenched him, and his hands trembled. He kept driving, not daring to look back. The next morning, Nathan couldn't sleep. As daylight crept through the windows, he turned on the TV, hoping for some distraction. But what appeared on the screen froze him in place. A breaking news report. The body of a woman was found in the woods behind an abandoned house. Authorities believe the victim had been dead for several days. Snowfall concealed the body until it was discovered this morning after a tip-off. The image on the screen showed the house Nathan had visited the previous night. His throat tightened. His heart pounding in his chest. If the woman had been dead for days, then who had opened the door for him? And, more importantly, what was he? Story 2. That winter, the cold was relentless. Snow blanketed everything, covering the narrow road that led to a remote cabin where I and my two closest friends, Rachel and Mark, decided to spend New Year's Eve. We wanted to escape the crowded city and find a quiet night together to talk and enjoy the silence. The cabin we rented was a small wooden house deep in the woods, far from any other buildings, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and eerily quiet. By the time we arrived, it was already dark. The wind howled through the trees, producing sounds like faint moans. The small cabin, with its warm golden light glowing from inside, made us feel a bit more at ease. Jason, the host, had left the keys in a small mailbox by the porch. His last message read, "Have a great night and enjoy the quiet." We quickly unpacked and started a simple dinner. Snow fell heavily outside, but inside the cabin, the crackling fire in the hearth created a cozy atmosphere. Rachel laughed as she told funny stories from work, while Mark opened a bottle of wine. Everything felt perfect. Around 9 p.m., Mark went outside to gather more firewood. Rachel and I stayed in the living room, enjoying the warmth. Suddenly, there were 3 knocks at the door, slow and deliberate. Rachel and I froze, exchanging puzzled glances. Who could possibly be out here at this hour, in such a remote place? Maybe it's Mark forgetting his keys, Rachel said, laughing nervously. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Mark. Standing on the porch was a tall man in a thick black coat. His face was pale, and his gray, hollow eyes stared at us with unsettling intensity. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I've lost my way. My car got stuck in the snow down the road. Could I come in and warm up for a moment?" Rachel hesitated, glancing back at me. Something felt wrong, his posture, the way he stared unblinking at us. My instinct screamed to refuse. "Sorry," I said quickly, stepping in front of Rachel. "We don't have much space here. Maybe you can find help at another house nearby." His gaze didn't waver. He stood there in silence for a few seconds, his breath visible in the freezing air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked slowly into the blizzard, disappearing into the swirling snow. Rachel shut the door, shivering. That was strange. He didn't even argue. I don't think he really needed help, I muttered, my eyes still fixed on the spot where he had stood. Mark returned soon after, carrying a large bundle of firewood. We told him about the strange man, but Mark just laughed. "You two are overthinking it. Probably just some guy who got lost," he said, tossing more wood onto the fire. But I couldn't shake the uneasiness. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, and the shadows in the cabin felt darker than before. As midnight approached, we raised our glasses for a toast. Just as we clinked them together, there were knocks at the door again. This time, they were louder, heavier, almost angry. Rachel dropped her glass, the sound of it shattering echoing in the room. No. It can't be him again. Mark, irritated, stood up and walked to the door. I'll take care of this. He opened the door wide, and we heard him gasp. Moments later, he collapsed onto the floor, his face pale as a sheet. What happened? I rushed to him. It's him. Mark whispered, his voice trembling. He's standing right there. I looked out the door, but the porch was empty. Snow continued to fall in silence. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The three of us sat huddled together in the living room, listening to every small sound from outside. Occasionally, I heard soft footsteps crunching in the snow, but when I looked out, there was nothing but darkness. We told ourselves we'd leave as soon as morning came. But when the first light of dawn broke through the frosted windows, a horrifying sight awaited us. Behind the cabin, buried in the thick snow, we found a body. The victim was Mark. Or at least, it looked exactly like Mark. His face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His hands stiffly clutching his chest as though he'd tried to protect himself from something. But Mark, our Mark, was standing right next to me, alive. Rachel screamed, and when I turned back, the footprints leading away from the cabin disappeared in an instant, as though they had never been there. Story 3. I remember that night clearly, a cold winter night with snow falling so heavily it blanketed the entire road. I had just finished a 5-hour delivery shift and decided to take one last order before heading home. Fatigue was creeping in, and the clock was nearing midnight. The streets were deserted, with faint streetlights casting a dim glow amidst the snowstorm, creating a strange and chilling atmosphere. As I drove down a deserted stretch of road, my headlights illuminated an old car parked at the edge of the road. It appeared suddenly, out of nowhere, in the middle of the white storm. The car looked abandoned, its lights off. And there were no signs of anyone nearby. Slowing down, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A strange intuition urged me to turn back and investigate. I parked my car a few meters away, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the scene. I called out loudly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Only the sound of the wind answered me. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I stepped out into the freezing air. The cold seeped through my thick coat, and each step I took on the snow produced a loud crunch that sent chills down my spine. The car was old, its paint peeling, with frosted windows obscuring the interior. When I shone my flashlight inside, I noticed something strange. The back seat was covered with torn fabric and muddy smudges. But what made my blood run cold was a small bloodstain on the steering wheel. Could something have happened here? I muttered to myself, my heartbeat quickening. Just then, I heard a faint sound, like a branch snapping, coming from the woods behind the car. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping through the dark trees. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. After a few tense moments of silence, I decided to return to my car and call the police. But as soon as I got into the driver's seat, a shadow flickered across my headlights. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to peer into the storm, but all I could see was the falling snow. My heart sank when I noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading into the forest. With shaky hands, I dialed the police and explained the situation. They assured me they would send someone, but with the severe weather, it would take at least half an hour. I couldn't just sit there. I can't let this haunt me, I thought, grabbing my flashlight and stepping out to follow the tracks. The trail led into the dark and eerily silent forest. My flashlight flickered in the biting wind. The footprints remained clear, leading deeper into the woods, but there was no one in sight. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper. It was distant, indistinct, and seemed to echo from all directions. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. But only the wind and the biting cold replied. As I turned to go back, my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood freeze. In the middle of the clearing lay a thick winter coat, half buried in the snow. Beneath the coat was a hand, pale, lifeless, and motionless. I stepped back in horror, only to feel something brush against my foot. Turning around, I found myself face to face with a tall shadowy figure. His face was deathly pale, his eyes cloudy and unblinking. "You've found me," he said, his voice deep and as cold as the night. I screamed and turned to run, but the figure didn't follow. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, police lights were flashing, illuminating the area. They ran toward me, asking what had happened. I pointed toward the woods, my words failing me as I tried to explain. The next morning, I received an update. In the woods, the police had found a body buried beneath the snow, not far from where I'd seen the shadowy figure. The abandoned car belonged to the victim, a woman who had been reported missing a few days prior. But the strangest part was this: when the police examined the area, they found no footprints leading into the woods, except mine. The body wasn't that of the man I had seen. And to this day, I still don't know who, or what, he was. Story 4. I work night shifts at a small gas station on the outskirts of the city. That winter night, snow fell heavily, blanketing everything in a cold, white stillness. The station was so quiet that the only sounds were the wind howling through the gas pumps and the occasional truck passing on the nearby highway. I was used to solitude on nights like these, but this particular night, the silence felt different, heavy and unsettling. Around 11 p.m., I was restocking shelves when the doorbell chimed. A man walked in, wearing a thick gray coat that looked worn and faded. His face was pale, and his deep-set eyes carried a haunting emptiness. He stood still by the counter, scanning the store as if searching for something. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you with anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man turned to me and gave a faint, almost lifeless smile. "Maybe, but first, I need some time." I didn't understand what he meant, but something about him felt off. He didn't buy anything, he just stood there, staring at the shelves in a way that made my skin crawl. The silence in the room grew so oppressive that I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Do you need anything, sir?" "If not, I need to get back to my work," I said, trying to sound professional, though my palms were already damp with sweat. The man didn't reply. After a few seconds, he turned and walked out, leaving wet footprints on the floor from the melting snow. I watched him through the glass door as he stood motionless in the parking lot, staring back at the station before slowly disappearing into the swirling snow. I tried to brush it off, but a sense of unease lingered. The station fell silent once more. Around midnight, I decided to check the area behind the building to make sure everything was secure. The snow continued to fall heavily, and the light from the street lamps cast eerie, shifting shadows on the ground. As I stepped outside, my eyes were immediately drawn to a dark corner of the parking lot. An old, beat-up truck was parked there. Its lights were off, and the engine was silent. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. "Why is there a truck here?" I muttered, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I approached the truck and shone my flashlight inside. The driver's seat was empty, but the interior felt oddly unsettling, like someone had just left, leaving behind an eerie stillness. After a while, I returned to the station, locked the doors, and activated the internal alarm system. Just as I turned around, a faint tapping sound came from the glass door. I froze and turned back to see the same man standing outside, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He didn't say a word, just tapped lightly on the glass, as if testing it. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound brave, though my voice quivered. The man stopped tapping, gave a faint smirk, and slowly stepped back into the darkness, vanishing behind the falling snow. I stood there frozen for a few minutes before deciding to call the police. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained everything, about the strange man and the truck in the lot. An officer checked the area but found nothing except footprints that were slowly being covered by the snow. "Probably just a passerby," they said, but I wasn't convinced. After the police left, I returned to the counter, trying to calm myself. I took a sip of coffee to steady my nerves, but around 2 a.m., a piercing sound echoed from the back door, a relentless banging. Gripping my flashlight, I cautiously walked toward the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. The door rattled violently, as if someone was trying to break in. When I shone my flashlight through the small window in the door, there was nothing but darkness. Just as I was about to turn away, a face suddenly appeared, pressed against the glass. It was the same man, but this time his eyes were wild with fury, and his expression was unhinged. I screamed and bolted back to the counter, hitting the alarm button and locking myself in the security room. Inside, I tried to catch my breath. But then, on the surveillance screen, I saw the back door suddenly swing open. The man stepped inside, but instead of heading toward me, he stared up at a corner of the ceiling. His hands trembled, as if he were under some kind of spell. Then, without warning, he collapsed to the floor, motionless. By morning, the police returned. They found the back door broken open and a body. It was another man, lying face down in the snow, his neck visibly strangled, with dried blood staining his sleeves. The police told me there were no footprints leading away from the lot, only mine. But I knew what I had seen, and I was certain that the man wasn't human. Story 5. I had just moved into a small house in a remote suburb, where snow blanketed everything white each winter. The area was so isolated that my nearest neighbors were hundreds of meters away. I worked remotely and didn't know anyone in the area. On my first Christmas Eve alone in the new house, I tried to keep things normal by playing some music and brewing a hot cup of tea. Around 10 p.m., while I was working in the living room, I heard a strange noise outside, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I turned off the music and tilted my head to listen, but the sound had disappeared. "Probably just an animal," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off a growing sense of unease. I stepped out onto the front porch, scanning the surroundings under the dim glow of the porch light. Snow was falling heavily, and I couldn't see anyone or anything unusual. But when I turned to go back inside, I noticed faint footprints leading from the road to my front steps, then stopping abruptly right at the door. The next morning, the footprints had been completely covered by fresh snow. I tried not to dwell on it, but the unease lingered. The second night, as I was sitting on the sofa watching a movie, I heard the sound again. This time, it was distinct, light tapping on the living room window. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed a flashlight. Hands trembling, I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. There was no one there, only the endless white of the falling snow. However, when I stepped outside to investigate, I found new footprints circling the house. This time, they stopped at the back window of my bedroom. What struck me as odd was that the footprints only went in one direction. There were no tracks leading away. Whoever it was had either disappeared or was still nearby. That night, I couldn't sleep. At around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise in the kitchen. It sounded like someone opening a cabinet. My entire body froze, but I forced myself to grab a flashlight and head toward the noise. The kitchen was eerily quiet when I arrived. I checked every cabinet and door, all of which were locked tight. As I turned to leave, a faint, chilling laugh echoed behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. No one was there. Just the small window slightly ajar, with snow blowing in. "Who's here?" I shouted, my voice shaking. No response, only the wind howling outside. I slammed the window shut, bolted it, and hurried back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I gripped the phone, ready to call the police at the first sign of trouble. On the third night, I decided I couldn't stay cooped up inside anymore. I armed myself with a flashlight and stepped out to check the area around the house. The snow was falling heavily, and the air was unnervingly silent. As I made my way around to the back of the house, I noticed fresh footprints leading into the small forest behind the property. Despite my growing fear, I followed the tracks. The flashlight beam illuminated the snow-covered trees, their shadows dancing eerily in the wind. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunching of my boots. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, distant and indistinct, coming from deeper in the woods. I stopped, heart racing, when my flashlight illuminated something hanging from a tree a few meters away. As I got closer, the beam of light revealed a sight I'll never forget, a body dangling from a tree branch, frozen solid, covered in snow. The pale face was turned toward me, its lifeless eyes wide open, staring blankly into the darkness. I let out a scream, dropping the flashlight into the snow. Then, I heard a soft crunch behind me, like someone stepping closer. I didn't dare turn around. My breath hitched as a cold voice whispered in my ear, "So, you found me." The next morning, the police arrived. They cut down the body and began their investigation, but there were no footprints leading to the tree, only mine. They identified the corpse as a man who had gone missing a week earlier, but they couldn't explain how he had ended up hanging in the woods. I left the house the very next day, but the image of those lifeless eyes and the chilling whisper still haunt me every night. I don't know if what I encountered was human, or something else entirely. Story 6. I had just returned to my apartment after a long day. This winter was harsh, with snow falling so heavily that every road was buried under a thick white blanket. I decided to take a week off work to relax, hoping that most people would return to their routines after the holidays, leaving me to enjoy the quiet. That evening, after taking a hot shower and settling on the sofa, I turned on the TV to pass the time. My small apartment on the 5th floor was unremarkable, except for the constant sound of wind howling through the window frames. At around 8 p.m., the intercom buzzer suddenly rang, shattering the calm silence. I stood up and walked to the intercom mounted on the wall. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of irritation. The other end remained silent for a few seconds before a hoarse, gravelly voice spoke. "Let me in. I need help." The voice was cold and emotionless, sending a shiver down my spine. I glanced out the window. Snow was falling heavily, and under the dim streetlight, I could see a man standing at the building's entrance. He was wearing a hooded coat and looked bundled up, but there was nothing familiar or neighborly about him. "I don't know you. What do you want?" I replied, trying to keep my tone firm. "I just need a place to stay." "I won't bother you." The voice wavered slightly, but there was something unsettlingly hollow in his words. I stood there for a moment, torn between reason and fear. Should I let him in? I wondered, but quickly shook my head. No way. Who goes asking for shelter at this hour, in this weather, at a random building? But then another thought crept in. What if he really needs help? What if he's in danger? I tried to dismiss the guilt, convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility. I decided to turn off the intercom and return to the sofa. A few minutes later, the buzzer rang again, this time, accompanied by loud, insistent knocks on my door. I froze in place. There was no way he could have gotten to the 5th floor unless someone had let him in downstairs. Moving cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. Only faint water stains on the hallway floor, as though melted snow had been tracked in from the staircase and stopped right outside my door. Who opened the front door? How did he get up here? My heart began to race, and a growing sense of unease crept over me. "This isn't right," I whispered, gripping the lock tightly. I went back to the sofa, but the feeling of safety was long gone. "I can't ignore this," I thought to myself. Maybe I should call the police, but what would I even tell them? A stranger asking for shelter? I have no proof of anything. At around 11 p.m., just as I was trying to calm down, another noise startled me, footsteps coming from above. I froze in place, my mind racing. "That's impossible," I muttered, my voice shaky. The apartment above mine had been vacant for months. Who could possibly be up there? I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling between fear and rationalization. It could be rats, or maybe someone broke in. But whatever the explanation, I didn't want to stay any longer. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the building manager, but the signal suddenly dropped. My screen displayed a chilling message: "No service." A cold sweat broke out over me. I stood up, holding a flashlight, and began checking every corner of the apartment. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the creaking floorboards beneath my feet made me flinch with every sound. "There's nothing to be afraid of, it's all in my head," I tried to reassure myself, but my words felt hollow. When I entered my bedroom, a faint whisper echoed right next to my ear: "You don't belong here." I screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. As the beam of light passed over the large mirror in the room, I froze. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me, the same man from downstairs. I spun around, but the room was empty. I sat huddled on my bed, eyes locked on the bedroom door. Every creak and gust of wind made me flinch. That night, I didn't sleep. I could only wait for daylight, praying this nightmare would end. The next morning, I decided to leave the apartment. But as I stepped into the hallway, a horrifying sight stopped me in my tracks. The man's lifeless body was hanging from the railing on the 6th floor, his face frozen and pale, covered in snow. His wide-open eyes seemed to stare directly at me, filled with terror. The police arrived and began their investigation, but they found no footprints leading to the railing. No one could explain how the man had entered the building. I moved out that very day, but the image of his frozen eyes still haunts me. Some things cannot be explained, and they're still there, right behind the door. Story 7. I lived in a rented house on the outskirts of town, where snowstorms often turned everything into a cold, desolate white canvas. After my roommate moved out, I decided to stay another year because of the low rent and quiet space. The house was 2 stories tall, old, but comfortable enough for me to live alone. This winter, the snow was heavier than usual. My office allowed us to work remotely, so I barely left the house for days. I turned my former roommate's bedroom into an office. But ever since I moved into that room, something felt off. On the second evening of working in the new room, a snowstorm hit hard. I was sitting at my desk when I heard a knock at the front door, a soft but distinct sound that echoed through the stillness of the house. At first, I thought it might be a delivery person, but when I opened the door, there was nothing but falling snow and the howling wind brushing against the bare tree branches. I stood there for a moment, the porch light casting a dim glow on the snowy ground. There were footprints leading to the door, but none leading away. I must be imagining things, I told myself, shutting the door and heading back to work. Around 11 p.m., while I was watching TV in the living room, I heard footsteps upstairs, clear, deliberate steps moving across the floor. My heart sank. That's impossible. I'm the only one here. I froze, trying to listen carefully. The footsteps were slow but heavy, as though whoever, or whatever, it was wanted me to hear them. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs. The moment I reached the landing, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and scanned the dark hallway. Is someone there? I called out, my voice shaky, echoing down the empty hall. No one answered. But then, from inside the former roommate's room, I heard a hoarse voice say, "I don't want to hurt you. I just need peace." Every muscle in my body locked up. "Who's there? Why are you in my house?" I shouted, but I didn't dare step closer. Silence. Gathering every ounce of bravery I had, I nudged the slightly ajar door open. The room was pitch black, lit faintly by the snow's reflection through the window. Snow covered the floor from a window that had been left wide open, and there, I saw a dark figure standing with its back to me. "Who are you?" I repeated, my voice trembling. The figure slowly turned but didn't step forward. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me. After an excruciating silence, it spoke, "This house doesn't belong to you. Leave before it's too late." I stumbled backward, shaking uncontrollably. "I don't understand. What do you want?" There was no response. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room deathly cold and a trail of wet footprints across the floor. The next morning, I resolved to leave the house for good. But before I packed my things, I decided to check every room one last time, especially my former roommate's room, where I had been working. While tidying up, I noticed the mattress on the bed was slightly askew. Out of curiosity, I lifted it, and froze in horror. Beneath the mattress lay the lifeless body of a young woman, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at me. Her body was pale and stiff, her wrists showing signs of restraint. Bloodstains surrounded her, long since dried into the fabric of the bed. I screamed, stumbling backward, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced with questions. How long has she been here? Who did this? How could I not have noticed before? With shaking hands, I called the police. When they arrived, I recounted everything that had happened. The investigation revealed that the woman had been dead for weeks, but no one knew how she got there or who had done this. I left the house that same day, unable to stay a moment longer. But the image of her lifeless eyes and the haunting whispers in the night remain etched in my memory. Some secrets should never be uncovered, and some shadows never truly disappear. Story 8. It was a cold winter night, the kind where snow blankets the ground and muffles every sound, leaving the world eerily silent. I worked the graveyard shift at a small, isolated gas station off the highway, surrounded by miles of open fields and dense forest. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and the quiet nights usually let me catch up on my books or scroll through my phone. The shift started like any other. My coworker left after a quick handover, muttering something about the snowstorm picking up. As he walked out the door, he paused and turned back to me, his face pale under the flickering fluorescent light. "If anything weird happens, don't go outside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed nervously. "Weird? What, like a ghost in the freezer section?" But he didn't smile. He just shook his head and left. By midnight, the wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and making the neon "open" sign flicker erratically. Snow had piled up outside, and the road was eerily empty. The gas station felt like an island in a sea of white, isolated and vulnerable. Around 12:30 a.m., a car pulled into the lot, a dark SUV. Its headlights cut through the swirling snow, but no one got out. I waited for a few minutes, expecting the driver to come inside to pay or buy something, but the car just sat there. The engine was off, and the windows were tinted, hiding whoever was inside. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my coat, I stepped out into the freezing air. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the vehicle. I knocked on the driver's window. "Hey, do you need help?" My voice felt swallowed by the storm. No response. I bent down to peer inside, but the glass was too dark to see anything. As I stood back up, a low, deep voice rumbled from behind me. "You shouldn't have come out." I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the whistling wind and the endless snow. Panicking, I hurried back into the gas station, locking the door behind me. I glanced back at the SUV, it was gone. For the next hour, I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself it was my imagination. But then, at 2 a.m., the lights in the station flickered and went out. The hum of the refrigeration units died, leaving only the sound of the wind. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and stood frozen behind the counter, listening. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the glass. No, 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 I whispered to myself, my breath fogging up the cold air around me. My phone's light trembled as I aimed it toward the front window. At first, there was nothing. But then, a pale hand pressed against the glass. A face followed, distorted by the frost-covered pane. It was a man, his eyes wide and unblinking, his breath forming clouds on the window. "Let me in," he said, his voice muffled but insistent. "I need to come in. It's so cold out here." I shook my head, backing away. "The station's closed. You'll have to move along." My voice cracked with fear. The man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, his face contorting into a strange, unnatural smile. "You're all alone in there, aren't you?" Suddenly, the tapping turned into pounding. The glass shook under his fists, and I could see the frost beginning to crack. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling. As I spoke to the operator, the pounding stopped. "Sir, is someone trying to break in?" the operator asked. I glanced at the window. The man was gone. But as I turned toward the back door, I heard a faint creak. The door was slightly ajar, snowflakes drifting in. My heart raced as I grabbed the only weapon I had, a wrench from under the counter, and crept toward the back. The storeroom was empty, but the door to the supply closet was wide open. Slowly, I approached it, my breath shallow and my hands sweaty despite the cold. "I know you're in here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it, "You shouldn't have come out." The door slammed shut. I screamed and stumbled back, dropping the wrench. The lights flickered back on, and for a moment, everything seemed normal, too normal. When the police arrived, they found me sitting behind the counter, clutching the wrench and staring blankly at the front door. I tried to explain what had happened, but it all sounded insane. They searched the station and found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. But then, one officer called out from the back. "Chief, you need to see this." In the supply closet, behind a stack of boxes, they found a body. It was the man from the window, his pale face frozen in the same eerie smile, his hands pressed together as if he'd been praying. Blood was smeared on the walls, spelling out one word, "Welcome." The officers looked at me, their faces pale with shock. "Are you sure you never let him in?" I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "He was never inside, was he?" To this day, I don't know how that man ended up in the supply closet. But every time I hear the wind howl in the dead of night, I think of his smile, and the warning I didn't heed. "You shouldn't have come out." Story 9. It was a cold, snowy Friday night, the kind where the world feels like it's wrapped in a suffocating silence. I had taken a few delivery orders to pass the time and earn some extra cash. The roads were slick with ice, and the quiet streets, blanketed in snow, seemed to stretch endlessly under dim streetlights. After a few routine drops, my delivery app chimed with a new order. The location wasn't a house or a building, it was an intersection just outside town, in the middle of nowhere. I frowned, muttering, "Who orders food to an intersection?" But curiosity got the better of me. I accepted the order, picked up the food, and began the drive toward the marked spot. The closer I got, the more desolate the area became. The usual hum of the town faded into the eerie stillness of the countryside. Snowflakes fell heavier, shrouding the road ahead. My GPS led me to a narrow dirt road that snaked through a dense forest. The location was marked just beyond this line of trees. "This doesn't feel right," I murmured, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The headlights barely illuminated the snow-covered trees as I reached the pinpointed location. There was nothing there, no house, no car, just the barren road surrounded by towering, shadowy trees. I parked, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the freezing air. The snow crunched under my boots, the only sound in the deafening silence. "Hello? Delivery?" I called, my breath fogging in the icy wind. No response. I checked the app and called the number listed for the order. After a few rings, someone answered. "You're here." The voice was deep, gravelly, and void of emotion. Yeah, but there's no one here." "Are you nearby?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. There was a pause. Then, the same voice replied, "Look closer." "I'm waiting." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The chill of the night suddenly felt sharper. My hands shook as I stuffed my phone back into my pocket and scanned the area. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the forest. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. "Is this your order?" The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, motionless. Slowly, it turned and began walking into the trees. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I followed. The footprints in the snow led deeper into the forest. I hesitated at the tree line, calling out again, "This isn't funny. If this is your idea of a prank, I'm leaving." From somewhere in the shadows, the voice responded, softer now but more menacing, "You've already come this far. Don't stop now." My legs felt like lead as I took another step forward. The trees grew denser, their branches heavy with snow, creating an oppressive canopy overhead. The footprints led to a small clearing, where a dilapidated shack stood, leaning precariously under the weight of the snow. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it back and forth. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello? I'm just here for the delivery. Please, let's get this over with." From inside the shack, the voice responded again, mocking this time, "Come in. We've been waiting for you." I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But something compelled me to step closer. The snow underfoot seemed quieter now, almost muffled. My hand reached for the door handle, trembling. "This is insane," I whispered to myself, pushing the door open with a creak. Inside, the shack was dark and suffocatingly cold. In the center of the room was a single chair. On it sat the bag of food I had been carrying. But when I looked down at my hands, I realized I was still holding the bag. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice barely audible. Behind me, the door slammed shut. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, echoing off the wooden walls. A low chuckle came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come. What do you want from me?" I screamed, backing toward the chair. The air felt heavy, suffocating. My flashlight shook in my hands as I swept the beam across the room. In the far corner, two glinting eyes appeared, reflecting the light. The figure stepped forward, a man, his face pale and contorted into a grotesque grin. His clothes were tattered, and his hands were stained with what looked like dried blood. "Leave? You brought this to me." His voice was no longer just a voice, it reverberated, filling the room with a bone-chilling resonance. I stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. I don't know who you are. Take whatever you want and let me go." The man's grin widened, unnatural and sinister. "Let you go? But we're just getting started." Suddenly, the light from my phone flickered and went out, plunging the shack into darkness. I fumbled to turn it back on, but the beam was weak, barely illuminating my shaking hands. I turned toward the door, now locked, and began pounding on it desperately. From behind me, the man whispered, "You shouldn't have followed." I screamed as I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. Spinning around, I swung the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Somehow, I managed to break the door open and stagger out into the snow. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, the icy wind cutting into my skin. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more taunting. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I slammed the door shut and sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stood at the edge of the trees, watching me, his grin glowing in the moonlight. The next morning, I saw the news: body discovered in forest shack. The victim was a missing man, found tied to the chair inside. Blood covered the walls, spelling out one word: stay. I tried to explain to the police, but my story sounded insane. The app order had disappeared from my history, as if it had never existed. Now, every time I pass through that part of town, I feel his eyes on me, hear his voice in the wind: "You shouldn't have followed." Story 10. It was a snowy December night, the kind of cold that burrowed into your bones and turned every breath into a ghostly fog. I had been working double shifts as a delivery driver for the local pizza shop, trying to scrape together extra cash for the holidays. Business was brisk despite the weather, people didn't want to venture out, and that meant more orders for me. By 10:30 p.m., I was on my final delivery, 2 large pizzas to a remote address on the outskirts of town. The GPS coordinates led me to a crumbling neighborhood, long forgotten by the rest of the city. The houses were spaced far apart, their windows dark, cars buried under layers of untouched snow. As I pulled up to the address, the porch light flickered weakly. The house stood apart, shrouded by towering trees whose branches bent under the weight of the snow. I parked on the icy driveway and hesitated, my stomach churning with unease. Something about the place felt wrong, but I grabbed the pizzas and approached the front door, knocking firmly. The door creaked open, and a man appeared. His face was pale, sunken, and gaunt, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. His eyes locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. "You're late," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I forced a smile. "Sorry about that. The roads are bad." 2 large pizzas, $24.50. He stared at me for a moment before stepping back. "Come in. It's freezing out there." I hesitated, my gut screaming at me to decline. "I'm fine here," I replied, shifting the weight of the pizzas. "If you could just..." "Come in," he interrupted, his voice sharper now. "It's too cold to stand there." Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the faint odor of something rotting. The dim hallway was lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, jagged shadows. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. The man shuffled toward a room at the end of the hallway. "Wait here," he muttered. "I'll get the money." I stood near the doorway, clutching the pizzas tightly. The house was deathly quiet, except for the faint creak of floorboards beneath my boots. My eyes wandered to the walls, where a collection of old photographs hung in mismatched frames. One photo caught my attention, a young woman with hauntingly familiar eyes. Her strained smile sent a shiver down my spine. A loud creak broke my focus. I turned to see the man standing at the bottom of a staircase, staring at me. His shadow stretched unnaturally across the walls. "You didn't touch anything, did you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I shook my head quickly. "No, just waiting here." "Do you have the money?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "She doesn't like it when people snoop." My blood ran cold. "She? He turned without answering, ascending the stairs slowly. "Stay there. Don't move." I waited, every nerve in my body screaming to leave. My gaze shifted to a partially open door at the end of the hallway. From the darkness beyond, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting ever so slightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of soft breathing. My grip tightened on the pizza boxes as I inched closer to the door. From upstairs, the man's voice boomed, "Don't go in there." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. But the door seemed to beckon me. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a broken window. A heavy chain lay coiled on the floor, rusted and stained. Deep scratch marks marred the wooden floorboards, leading toward the doorway. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted me. The man was coming back, his steps deliberate and heavy. I backed away from the door and pretended I hadn't moved. He appeared in the hallway, holding a crumpled $20 bill and some coins. "Here," he said, thrusting the money toward me. His eyes darted to the open door. "Did you look in there?" I shook my head vigorously. "No, I didn't." His jaw tightened, and he leaned in closer. "If you value your life, you'll leave now." My hands trembled as I took the money and backed toward the front door. "Okay. Thank you. Have a good night." Just as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold. "She doesn't like visitors," he whispered, his breath reeking of decay. I bolted out of the house, stumbling over the icy steps. As I reached my car, I glanced back. The man stood in the doorway, watching me. The flickering porch light cast his face in eerie, shifting shadows. I started the engine, but before I could pull away, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the house. It was high-pitched and guttural, like something inhuman. I froze, staring at the house as the porch light flickered one last time and went out. The next morning, I couldn't shake the dread. I checked the news, and my stomach dropped. "Body found in abandoned house," the headline read. The victim was a young woman, her remains discovered chained to the floor in a locked room. She had been missing for over a decade. The man? He was nowhere to be found. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was in that house. But I'll never forget the man's warning: "She doesn't like visitors."